Welcome, everybody, to the Holistic Justice Salon series. It's hosted by myself, Ana Jelsi Velasco Sanchez, and Alicia T. Crosby.
Hey
We
all.
are so excited to have all of you join us for the next five-part series running over the next 5 months. Just a reminder to folks of who we are, or maybe your first introduction to who we are, so you can get a feel from who you're working with, learning from, teaching. As I said, I'm Ana Jelsi Velasco Sanchez. I am the founder of Conjunto, which is a collective of POC freelancers that are working at the intersection of spirituality and justice. I am also a freelancer myself. I'm self-employed. I'm a consultant, a public educator on issues of justice. I am also an artist and a writer. So Jack, Jill of all trades. And as I mentioned before we started our recording, I work with Alicia a lot and just adore her. And so I'm going to pass the baton to her and let her share a little bit about who she is. And then we're going to give a reminder of what this series is all about. So Alicia, take it away.
Hey y'all. My name is Alicia Crosby, she, her pronouns. I am a writer, speaker, sometimes reluctant minister, executive director of Center for Inclusivity, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit. And we do work around intersectional equity, inclusivity, and identity primarily. And so that means I talk about a lot of things in a lot of different ways. And I am super excited tonight to be doing this program with Ana Jelsi. This has been a dream. It's like a dream being actualized. She and I have been talking about this probably for the better part of a year. Like, what would it mean to facilitate conversations and invite people into those conversations where we speak about like justice and wellness and how these things come together. And so we're really excited to spend the next hour or so with you in conversation and open it up for questions like within the community that's gathered, because it's not just Ana Jelsi and I. Here, there is a community that's gathered around us. So welcome.
Yes. Speaking of the fact that we've been talking about this for the better part of a year, what I wanted to kick things off, Alicia, with letting folks know what we each as individuals mean when we say holistic justice, why we chose that name for this series. I will say, as far as the name of the series, the other part, calling it a salon, that was Alicia's idea. I didn't really know what that was. Went and did my little Google thing, and I loved it so much because what I read up on was, particularly in France, these salons happened in a time when women had very little voice or authority in mainstream culture, and certainly in politics or issues of the day. But they created these salon spaces where they not only dominated the spaces, they dictated what they looked like, what was talked about, how those conversations took shape. And so for both of us to be women of color, the idea of a salon just seemed perfect. But there's that other part of the name, holistic justice. What do you mean by holistic justice, Alicia?
So when I say holistic justice, I really do think of like justice seeking, right? Like looking at equity, looking at equality, looking at inclusivity and advancing all those things, but being conscious of wellness, right? And I say wellness and not health, because wellness, there's like an intentionality and a consciousness behind it. And so yeah, health is definitely a part of it, but it's like it's a mindful way of being healthier in the pursuit of these things. And so, and have an opportunity to talk about all this and to bring these things together, I think it's possible. And it's necessary for us to be mindful of like, what does it mean for us to be, I don't know, as whole as possible doing the work? Because there's so many things that chip at our dignity, at our humanity, that would come up against our personhood as we like work towards equity in varying ways. And so if we can speak about how to be just a little bit more tender and caring and compassionate and aware of one another, and then out of that awareness really take care of each other, that's the type of commitment that I want to make in this work. But Ana Jelsi, I'm interested in hearing what holistic justice means to you. So yeah, tell us.
Definitely, absolutely all of that. I think for me, the one addition so absolutely wellness, absolutely how do we care for each other in this movement? I think what I've been doing, working in movement spaces, justice oriented spaces for, 10 plus years now. And what is So often the way those spaces work is it's concerned with survival. Like, how do we just get through the day? How do we just deal with the myriad of forms of oppression that are weighing down on us? And I think with holistic justice, it demands more for us. So we aren't concerned just with survival, but with, as you're talking about, wellness, wholeness, on a spiritual, emotional, and physical level. And I would say that the addition to that for me would be learning to have these conversations outside of silos. So when I say holistic, it's not just that wellness, the way holistic is often used. It's also holistic in terms of the collective. So across movement spaces, across particular areas of concern. How if my passion is LGBTQ justice and someone else's passion is decolonization, how do we work across movements for a fuller, more holistic form of justice, a more lasting one that is accessible across community lines? So when I think about holistic justice, that's what I'm thinking about. Mm-hmm. So all of that being said, we brought all of that into wanting to do this series, and we decided we can definitely solve this in 5 quick conversations. So the way we broke these down is, first, what we're going to do this evening, which we're calling it Thank You Next. Thank you, Ariana Grande. Intra-movement relationships. And Alicia is going to walk us through what the topics within that are that we're going to touch on. Then next time we get together, we're going to talk about inter-movement relationships. And that one we're calling You Can Stand Under My Umbrella. Thank you, Rihanna. We'll move the following week. We'll go to Pay Me What You Owe Me. We're going to talk about investing in people and fair compensation. Then we'll talk about It's Like I'm Powerful with a little bit of tender, self-care and healing. So that wellness side that Alicia kept touching on. And we'll finally end with Grind Until You Own It, which is strategies for a holistic approach. So once we've talked about all of these things that are necessary to pursue holistic justice, how do we actually do it? What are some tangible steps that we can take as individuals and as a community? So those are the things we're going to cover week to week. And I'm going to let Alicia kind of talk about how we're going to break things down this evening, and then she's going to kick off our conversation.
Okay. So over the course of the next hour, we're going to get into 4 areas, 4 primary areas. Like, there are tons of tributaries here. But the first thing we're going to do is DTR, define the relationship. Then we're going to shift into replicating dominant patterns, and like look at the impact that has like in the work. We're going to segue into toxic wokeness, because that's a thing. Mm. And then we're going to end the time that Anna Jussie and I are going back and forth in conversation with examining disposability politics. So, yeah, DTR, define the relationship. I think what's super interesting when we talk about like justice, and really when we talk about like anything in life, this is a place that we find ourselves potentially coming back to. Like, is defining relationships, and having clarity around, you know, what exists, what are the expectations, and I don't know, like, Anna Jussie, do you feel like we do that? Like, in justice work, do we do an adequate job of defining relationships?
No, I don't think that we do. And then I think we do, and I don't want to jump on what you might be bringing us to. I think not only do we not do that, we apply language and presumed intimacy and importance on relationships just de facto as a result of being in justice spaces. And we don't talk about what it means to follow through with that. So we talk about being family, being in it together, and that implies a lot of responsibility. And we don't actually talk about what that means. So then when we get into disposability and doing away with people, how does that line up with this like constant use of family where we're talking about? I don't think we ever really break that down.
Absolutely. I think what you're saying is like super spot on, right? Like, there's like this conflation of relationships. I mean, and really when it boils down to it, like, relationships like all have different weights to people, and without like speaking about like what our needs are, we potentially do violence to one another. So I think it's like, we look at holistic justice, right? Like, we look at this integrative, you know, model, framework, scaffolding, I don't know, like, you know, this is a thing that's just, it's here. It's important to have boundaries of some sort. And I think that that's a thing that like sometimes goes missing in the work, that people don't always like have the boundaries, have boundaries around themselves, or understand the boundaries that others have. And a lot of times that comes because we don't speak about things. Like we get so concerned with like delving into the work and just like working for the sake of change that we're not speaking about like who we are as people and like and naming, hey, this is what respect means. This is what I need to be okay, and not walk away with like wounds, like whether they be psychic, emotional, and sometimes physical wounds,
Yes.
because we haven't paid attention to like what the other person might need. Hell, we haven't even named like what it is that we need in these situations. And so like there needs to be something, I think, in movement spaces, a mechanism where we do that from jump, and not only just from jump, but like consistently, because our needs from day to day change, which means
Yes.
that our boundaries have changed, which means the nature of our relationship is constantly in flux. There's a fluidity that needs to exist that, just in my experience, doesn't in a lot of places. It's not there.
Yeah, and I think it complicates the conversation even further when you think about the fact that what what you need and what healthy boundaries looks like for you may not be the same as what it looks like for me. And so there's that one need for conversation there, but it's complicated even further when you think about culturally, racial and across racial and ethnic lines, across if you're thinking, faith or even Judeo-Christian specific spaces, denominational lines. There are all of these things that complicate this need to have a very clear conversation about what the boundaries, the parameters of the relationship are, and how you're supposed to act within them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things within that having to have the DTR is who is bringing people together to have that DTR, who holds power in that conversation, who's deciding how that conversation unfolds,
Mm-hmm.
and what success looks like.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that like when we do the work of DTR, when we define these relationships, we're also defining expectations. And there is a way that maybe we protect each other and help each other like avoid harm, or at least mitigate the harm that would exist, like when we outline things. Something that you hit on a little bit earlier, and I think it's important to speak to, is we have like these different relationships that like people, or there's this, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. There are different types of relationships that sometimes people bring up in the work, right? Like, so they'll say like, oh, we're family, oh, we're friends, but like that's assumptive. Like, again, like these relationships have different weights with different people. And like to be real, like I had a conversation with somebody last week and they're like, yeah, and like in this space, we're all friends. I'm like, I don't like those people. I don't trust them. I don't know them. And friendship is important to me. Like Anna Jelsi is someone who I call my friend. And it's because over the last several years, we've spent time crying together, laughing together, listening to one another. When we've screwed up and gotten it wrong, calling each other into accountability. And it's just like, girl, you need to get it together. Like, you need to do better than what you just did.
Yeah.
But there's a degree of trust that's built. And like over these years, I think that like part of what has allowed that trust to like exist is because we've talked about our needs. We've talked about our boundaries. We've talked about what works for us and what doesn't work for us communicatively. We've talked about our insecurities and our fears. And this has allowed for us to grow in such a way that when we say that we're friends, when we say that we're colleagues, like these are the expectations that we have, is like we function like within the boundaries like of those it's like a word I'm looking for. Words are hard sometimes, guys. But yeah, when we function within the parameters of the relationship that like we've named it to be, we know what that means because we've taken the time to define it.
Yeah, and I think we've taken the time to define it, and I think one of the things that defines, if I can speak for our relationship, is that we've moved beyond what often prevents these relationships from not being manipulative or not being unhealthy. Is we have made a point to move beyond a purely transactional relationship. Mm-hmm. So if I'm calling Alicia or she's calling me, I don't expect that every time she's calling me that there's a need or a demand or that it's purely work related. We've moved beyond the transactional. I think even if not only even, but also in particular in justice spaces, we tokenize and commodify relationships with one another. And we're only as close for as long as it's beneficial to the movement work I'm trying to do, to the platform I'm trying to build.
Mm-hmm.
And that's incredibly toxic.
Mm-hmm. And there's part of me that wonders, like, when people are extractive, when they are tokenizing, when they are transactional in the way that they function in these spaces, what does it mean when we assign titles like friend,
Mm-hmm.
like family, like you're my sibling, you're my cousin?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that mean for these relationships that we have with other people who occupy that space differently than the toxic way that perhaps those who've taken on those mantles have?
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we can, do you want to move to the manipulation of relationships or straight into toxic patterns, Alicia?
I mean, maybe toxic patterns might be a good place to go.
Okay. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind people, and by remind, I mean say for the first time, because I forgot to in the beginning, that while Alicia and I are sort of dominating the conversation right now, because we have so much we wanted to touch on to set the tone for how we're going to have our time together over the next 5 months, we do want you to put questions in the chat box. We're going to have time at the end to talk during the recording, where we're going to answer some questions. And we're also going to have what we're calling moving forward the after hours kiki, which just means at the hour mark, the recording will end, no matter where we are. We'll say we're done for the night, but then the after hours kiki will not get recorded. We'll have 20 minutes or so where if you want to, you can stay on the line and we can chat a little more freely without a recording of what we're saying. So if questions, carry on over into that, that's totally fine. Mm-hmm. So that said, going into replicating dominant patterns, which we started out calling it replicating toxic patterns, and I realized that wasn't true to what it is I wanted to talk about. So once you've had the DTR, assuming it happens and it happens in a healthy way where you really get to lay out these expectations, where you really get to lay out boundaries, then it becomes a question of are people holding to those? And not only in relationships, but in how movement work unfolds and the way actions happen and the way organizing is done, whatever it may be, workshops, trainings, are the standards that were set forth in the beginning being held to? And if not, what does that mean for what's happening in that space? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Alicia and I wanted to talk about was often what problematizes the seemingly like wonderful relationship at the beginning is that we begin to replicate things that we created new spaces in the first place to not do that, to learn a way to try something else, to live in through a different pattern. And then we start replicating things, intentional or not. And so I want to talk about this idea of that you can't just blame the system, you have to unlearn it. And so I think we go blame the system, create new system, and then just take everything that the one over here taught us, and that's what we use to run this new one. And then it just becomes the same toxicity happens. Mm-hmm. And so the reason I wanted to switch from the language of toxic to dominant patterns is I don't know that I believe everything we learn from dominant culture, everything we learn from dominant systems is inherently unjust, is inherently wrong. I think we live in a culture where we love binaries. It's really comfortable for us to label something as black, white, good, bad, pure, evil. And there's really, most things function in that liminal space where it's a little bit of both. It's something else entirely. It's not inherently good or bad. And I think it's the same with the patterns that we learn from dominant culture. I think, unfortunately, we don't inspect and critique those closely enough to figure out, are there ways in which we can apply this skill or this mindset that we got from dominant culture in a healthier, more liberative way, in a way that offers healing rather than more fundamentalism, because fundamentalism is definitely a thing that can happen in progressive and justice-oriented spaces, just like it can in any other space. And so I think I wanted to start there, Alicia, and get your thoughts on this idea of, are there good things that we can take over from dominant culture, from dominant systems?
I think so. I mean, there's a reason why they're dominant, and it's not always that they are like soul-crushingly oppressive. There's sometimes there's systems of organizations. There are sometimes, methodologies that could be useful. But I think that there is this piece around interrogation that sometimes goes lacking. And that's a thing I think that comes from like marginalized communities and from marginalized persons. It's like we question everything. Like I know that I question everything. And that's something that I learned from not just like colleagues like in justice work. That's stuff that I learned from my mama and my grandmama. Like
I mean,
we
in
just
fairness,
don't
we're
go to
both
everybody's
around eights, so
that
it's built in. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go
but
ahead.
like, yeah, no worries, no worries. I mean, but I think about like what it means to question. And I, had a conversation recently with my mom, whatever, and like she was like questioning, like, why would you go out to eat at that place? Do you know what they put in their food? Do you know if they wash their hands? Do you know this? Do you know that? And I think that like, there is something to be said of like being like overwhelmed and held in, and have your animation like stopped because of all the questions. But also there's deep wisdom in questioning and asking, why do we do these things? And like, and what's happening here? And what are people's values? What are they bringing to the table? Are they working for my good? Are they working for my harm? Like, what are their intentionality here? And I think that sometimes dominant systems and actors working for those entities.
Did we lose Alicia?
Stop us at the reign of these things. No, wait, can we hear me?
Yep, go right ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no. Okay, no worries. Yeah, I froze up. But yeah, to question is to push at the dominance. It's to push back, at the thing that was never questioned and allowing it to continue to live in perpetuity. And so I think that like, yes, there are some good things, but like, if we're ever not allowed to question, if we're never allowed to like interrogate both ourselves and the systems, then we need to be wary.
Yeah. And I think the allowing ourselves to interrogate and question, once we've acknowledged that like maybe there's things we want to hold on to, maybe there's ways in which to replicate certain aspects of dominant culture that can be, as I said, liberative, then I think one of the first steps we need to be taking is how do we learn a new understanding of power that it lets us make that movement from oppressive to liberative when we're talking about technically the same mindset or the same actions. And so I think part of that is you hear, we talked about the DTR, the defining the relationship, and that's often language that's used in romantic relationships, but we're using it for movement spaces. The same thing in intimate relationships. You also often hear this language of cycle of abuse. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about is this cycle of abuse, cycle of oppression, of violence, and that in the same way in a relationship where you begin to replicate the same pattern over and over and over again, I think we do that in movement spaces when we haven't learned to interrogate not only if things should function in a certain way, but how they function, who has power, how can power move from person to person, how it functions, whether or not people are pursuing power for power's sake, all these like myriad of questions we can get into. But I think at the end of the day is just interrogating these learned behaviors, which honestly are ways to cope. Like you learn those behaviors so that you can function in dominant society, because dominant society told you that's how things function. So it's a coping mechanism, and I get why we carry it even into movement spaces. So I think the question then becomes how do we begin to undo that cycle, or can it be redeemed? Is there something redemptive in how we can approach it? And so I think that brings us in an effort to stamp out anything that resembles dominant culture, because dominant culture has often done so much harm to so many people. So there's this natural effort, again, with like coping and self-preservation, to stamp out anything that resembles it. I think that kind of takes us to this next part of our conversation, which is toxic wokeness. And so it is the nature of trauma, to be traumatized, to be on high alert. I mean, I think about, I'll use a personal example, having lived most of my life teetering, just above, just below poverty lines, and dealt with, the debt collectors and the lights being turned off and not being sure about groceries and all these different things, have built trauma responses into me. If a number on my phone rings and I don't know it, my entire body reacts. If the doorbell rings and I didn't expect someone, my body reacts of like, oh no, someone's coming for the rent, even if I know I paid it. Like, I have trauma response to these things from years and years of dealing with stuff. So I think the same thing happens in movement spaces. There's a trauma response to anything that triggers or reminds us of how things function in dominant spaces where we didn't have power, and a form of power reclamation, while it may be not inherently right or wrong, or possibly even a really positive thing, can begin to look toxic. And so I want to kind of move there to you, Alicia, and start talking about when we've started creating those cycles of abuse, and now we're trying to stamp them out because we recognize their presence. How can that lead to toxic wokeness? Is there such a thing as toxic wokeness, and what does that mean for us?
Yes, there is. And I think that, like, there, by you sharing like this really personal example, I think you speak about a side of toxic wokeness that goes missing. But the thing I think that like kind of reigns supreme in what I've witnessed to is the posturing, right? Like, so yes, some things are definitely rooted in people having trauma responses, like based on like having to have survived and done what they needed to do to survive. But there's also like, this virtual signaling, like, I want you to know where I stand. And out of that, I'm going to like hold my body, hold my views, hold up my views in a certain way, in order for you to understand that I am appropriately woke. And that you can't be woker than me. It's like the woke Olympics. And it's just like harmful and gross. And I think we all lose. Like, I think we all lose like when we're doing this work of posturing, because like it means that we're not doing the work of relationship. It means that we kind of, going back to what we were speaking about, of these patterns of dominance, we're creating a degree of absolutism. We're saying like, it is only this. This is the only way. And if you do not fit within this like very prescriptive like mode of functioning and being, then there's no place for you here. And I think this will at some point take us to what we're going to talk about with disposability, because at some point, if people are trying to like establish like their means or their mode of wokeness as being like the ultimate, then anyone who's diverging from that does get thrown away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's hard for me, I'll speak for myself, like it's very, I don't know, maybe it's very weird or very fortunate that I feel really pushed to have conversations about this and to create space to have conversations about this, because I am not the person who naturally thinks of things as like toxic wokeness as being real or being as prevalent as some might claim. For better or worse, I much more comfortably relate with the people who are having labels like PC culture and being forced into respectability politics and being tone policed and being told they're toxic. I much more relate with the person being labeled that way than I do with the ones doing the labeling and claiming that it's for the sake of relationship and for the sake of kindness or goodness. And so I actually struggle with because it's hard for me to see that there's such a thing. It's hard for me to see it as toxic when it feels like it's this like outcry of, I've had so little power for so long. And so then that's when I have to have that gut check moment for myself and be like, oh, I see I see the potential for me to get to a place of toxicity, out of my hurt, out of my like having limited access to power in so many other spaces. And the reality is like in justice spaces, I have a certain degree of respect that I've garnered. That sounds so cocky. I don't mean it that way, but like, it's kind of like, I think about it this way. You think about churches of color where people, every other moment in their life, they have no respect. And then if they're a leader in a church of color, how tightly you hold on to that, because it's the one day of the week, particularly in the Black church, you hear this conversation. It's the one day in the week where you have power and authority. And so of course you would hold on to that tightly. And I think that I see the same thing at the root of toxic wokeness. And so I have a desire to show a great deal of grace, even though I increasingly am recognizing that it does exist and that it can have very harmful effects. And so that's,
Mm-hmm. And I
something
think,
that I'm struggling with.
and I think that like what you're sharing in terms of like the trauma of it all makes sense for people who have marginalized identities. But like part of toxic wokeness is that there are folks who like adopt this posture of like all knowingness,
Mm.
and they already come from places of privilege, and that privilege is being enacted like in these spaces. And so we were asked a question like to give like an example of toxic wokeness, and I will give you one of my favorites.
Uh-oh.
Oh, Jesus. So I remember after the 26th election, directly after, there was a movement, and sweet Jesus, these spaces still exist, but the safety pin movement.
I knew you were going to say safety pin.
Yes, I surely did say the safety pin. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is there are people who wanted to genuinely, I think, perhaps some of them, they genuinely wanted to signal that they could be safe people. I already have issues like with the language around safety, but that can be a conversation for another day. I think that to define safety, just kind of getting into it briefly, to define safety without doing some degree of or having some degrees of conversations, again going back to DTR, defining the relationship, defining our parameters, is to do violence, because you're not going to make assumptions for another person and establish like this is like safe, because you don't know. That being what it is, I remember getting into like really aggressive conversations, let's call them that, let's not call them arguments, but maybe let's call them arguments, because that's really what they were, with people who are like, I am an ally, and how dare you critique the fact that I'm wearing a safety pin. It's like, when did I ask you for this? Like, when did we have a conversation where I signaled to you that this is the way that I needed you to show up for me? And in order for people to be able to stand, right, in the fullness of like their wokeness, it's like, well, I'm doing this for you. It's like, but again, like we ain't have, you don't know me, you don't know my interests, you don't know what I care about, you don't even know what I'm feeling in this moment, like, you know, and what it means for me as a queer Black woman. Like, you don't know what I'm holding right now, nor have you asked, but yet you're telling me what I need and what you're going to do for me based on the needs that you've never inquired about. So when I think about toxic wokeness, I think about things like that, where people are making assumptions, and when they are doing this virtual signaling, like through the wearing of safety pins and pussy hats, because that was another one for me. So they're wearing paraphernalia, they're using certain types of language, they're not just reading books, but posting, hey, look at my Insta, look at all these books that I've read by, you know, these authors of color, or these people who have these marginalized identities in these different ways. Like, it's showmanship. And it's not to say that everyone who is wrestling, grappling with trying to understand like what the pursuit of justice means for them submits to this, but I do think this is something that happens as a way for people to appear that they belong, because that's ultimately what it is. It's like people want to belong to something. They're just not necessarily going about it the right ways.
Yeah, and I think that question of, you know, are there examples of toxic wokeness, really naturally brings us into this next part of the conversation, which is, I think at the end of the day, the fulfillment of toxic wokeness is disposability. It's the throwing out of people, not of ideas or of behavior, but entire people. And so that is this fulfillment of toxic wokeness. And so I wanted to spend our last little bit of time before we get into Q&A talking about that. This touches a little bit on what I was already saying about, you know, one, I don't think that it's a binary. And also that I think that this is maybe very strong word. I think this can be situational. The determination of whether it's something is positive or negative, healthy or unhealthy, I think to a degree is situational. And so with the disposability politics or cancel culture, you'll hear a lot. What we're talking about is total divestment from individuals and from whatever they offer, whatever platform they have. And so the reason I say I think some of this is determined by situation or by location of the person being disposed of, I think is the first, and who's doing the disposing. I think, I keep saying I think, and I don't think, it is a part of the conversation that is missing when we talk about disposability. We are always talking, when you hear that language, it's like thrown out as a condemnation or critique without any acknowledgement of the fact that, again, going back to power and having power for the first time, being able to assert boundaries for the first time, disposability culture and cancel culture are a manifestation of being able to do that for the first time. So when the critique is coming from dominant culture, from the dominant community that might feel some relation to whoever they feel has been disposed of, that's where I think one of the first things we need to touch on is who's doing the canceling and who's being canceled. So it's sort of this question of like punching up or punching down. So, and I think a lot of times cancel culture and disposability culture is a punching up. It's, I have so little influence over your life, but what I can do is saying that I am completely divesting from you and what you offer. So if you're a celebrity, your platform, politician, voting for you, all of that. Now, I'm saying that to acknowledge why it might exist, why people might be doing it. I'll speak for myself and say that that doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's right or helpful, at least not to what I see as holistic justice, how I want to be pursuing justice. And so if your concern is purely with the legalistic understanding of justice, with righting wrongs, with checks and balances, then disposability and cancel culture can work to a much greater degree. If it is healing and liberation for the largest number of people possible, offering a way back for the largest number of people possible, then I don't think it can be nearly as effective. Because so often what it includes is no pathway back. Mm-hmm. It's exile without an opportunity for return, for restoration. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's where I struggle with it because of how I've chosen to pursue justice. So I think the first question becomes, what is your intent? How are you pursuing justice? Alicia, I want to pass it to you and kind of see how your first reaction to that language.
Yeah. This is one of the things that I've really appreciated, just like in us having conversations about this, like yes, tonight, but also outside of this in our relationship, because you help me see disposability politics and cancel culture like from a different perspective, because I know that my first inclination is to think about it as being something that is isolating, that is dehumanizing, and I didn't see it as a way of holding on to power and also like it being like really protective overall until like we started getting into these conversations about it. So one of the things that I just personally do is like I try not to call people trash, because like that's part of like what comes with disposability. Everyone's like, oh, you're trash, or this is garbage, whatever. I like to refer to people as garbage monsters because I think that it is possible for people to play in the garbage without themselves being thrown away. Mm. And so yeah, over the last like year or so, as I've heard like, you're canceled, you're trash, this, that, and the third, it's like, no, they're a garbage monster. Like this is like where they make their home. But they can also choose to be elsewhere at some other point in time. But this is where they at right now. Mm. I think what I'm challenged by with disposability, and I think this seeming reliance on it in the time in which we live, is because to throw someone away and to cancel them means that they can't be held accountable. And that's the thing that I really like when we are looking at like disrupting these cycles of harm. Like that's the thing that I find myself wondering about. Like even if there's not a pathway back, like within the scope of this community that exists here, who are they in relationship with that is going to hold is going to hold them, who's going to call them in, who's going to speak to them, to counsel, to be present to them in such a way that there is change that can happen in their lives. Like, so someone, I mean, and I'll use a bit of a personal example and not use name, but there are people who have like done some real fucked up things to me. Yeah. And these things have been profoundly hurtful. They've crossed the lines of professional and, and personal relationships. And I'm in a place where I know that I can't be in relationship with them. It's just like, I don't trust you. And if I don't trust you, like things like respect and like all that go out the window too.
Yeah.
But I'm very conscious of how they may have relational ties with other people. And I'm careful about how I speak about them in spaces, because what happened between us didn't necessarily happen between them and the other person. And even if like I do invite other people into like how I'm holding my pain around like what they did, especially if like what they did was like, an issue of justice, if it was unjust in some capacity, I maintain that there is a way that they can be called in by that other person that like I don't have to be present for. So there is a way back to relationship of some sort for them. It's just not here. And I wonder sometimes if cancel culture, if like we're in mass, like in like entire community saying like, fuck you forever, then like what happens? Like, does that person just go to a different system and like can perpetuate that same harm? And so like those are some of like, my initial like feelings and thoughts like when I think about disposability, because I just really bear concern. Like if it's not everybody's system.
You froze for 1 second, but I didn't catch the last sentence.
Oh yeah, I was just saying like what happens like, if you're just like thrown away, like if you've left the system, like how do we stop the cycle of harm if no one's in relationship with you? And that's the thing that I fear with disposability and with cancel culture. Like if enough people cancel you, then who's going to make sure that you don't do this somewhere else and more people aren't being affected by your violence?
And I think showing again how these things are all connected, going back to that DTR, and we keep using our relationship, Alicia, as an example of that DTR. So, with the being frank and open, Alicia and I have both had some issues with being really deeply hurt by people who are in movement spaces that we both occupy. And part of our DTR, part of how we've defined our relationship is this very sometimes brutal and necessary honesty of like, this is exactly what that person did to me. This is how much I can or cannot tolerate your relationship with that person. Whether like, and so we've had very frank conversations of like, I can be in the room with you and so, but I can't be in the room with you and that person. I can manage to hear about this person, but I cannot hear about, like, we are so clear with the boundaries of our own relationship, even as far as they relate to those who have hurt us. And it allows those people not to be completely thrown out of movement space. Like I don't have to run around, which I'll be honest, my inclination, loyalty is something I value deeply. And so Alicia has heard this from me. My inclination when one of my girls tells me that they've been hurt by somebody, I'm like, okay, who do I hate? I'm ready. Like they're done. And so
it's true.
And then I'll be like, I'll be so quick to cut someone out. And so when I'm talking about these things, I'm not talking about them from this lofty place of like, I can, make space for everyone. Why can't you? I can't. I'm horrible at it. I have to be really intentional. Because if you hurt someone I love, like, I don't need you. And Elisa is actually someone who's helped me remind me that like the relationship does not need to be completely disposed of because of harm that she may have experienced. But there are ways to offer accountability in relationship to that person. It might look different than it did before, but it can be done. I want to take us to, sorry, do you want to say something, Alicia?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we were going to the same place where questions? We put into the questions, yes. Because there actually is one that's like really good around what happens with institutions, and like, and how do we deal with disposability as it relates to institutional spaces. So this is like fascinating, right? Because like this conjures up like so many thoughts like in me, because I think of institutional spaces or organizational spaces that Ana Josie and I have like divested from because of the ways in which like, these systems have perpetuated harm. One, I think it's a good idea to just keep in mind that institutions are made up of people. And so like if there is some degree of, conversation that can be see like change come forward and for like progress to actually be made and for like the harm to be rectified. I think that like that's first step in that, but sometimes like divestment is like your real option. It's like, you know, when you've had the conversations, like when you've helped not only, you know, when you've not only just like, given suggestions for what could happen, but in the words of one of our peers who like I think so highly of, Naomi Washington Leaphart, she shares like that she believes in this premise of co-struggling. When you've made that offer to co-struggle and people are not like meeting you there, sometimes you need to pull out. And sometimes like you need to divest in such a way where not only you pull out, but you warn other people who share in similar identities of the harm that they may experience in that space so that they don't experience the violences that you have. But yeah, I think, you know, conversation is always our go-to, and like in like kind of like defining the relationship, reasserting the boundaries, like letting people know where something went awry. But yeah, sometimes like pulling out and encouraging others to do the same until this institutional body or organization or whatever is accountable for the harm that they perpetuated in your world. Anna Chelsea, do you have any thoughts to share?
I mean, I think the example that immediately comes to my mind is, you know, up until a year and a half ago now, maybe almost 2 years now, I was for several years, leading a racial justice ministry at the church I was attending. And I invested so much time and energy and finances into co-leading that group. And it was a really painful uphill battle with a church that on a national level was being celebrated as this like multicultural church, this example of how to do multiculturalism right. And then here I was as a woman of color in the church feeling like I'm like trudging through quicksand to try and accomplish anything, to have any conversation about justice. Every time I asked about justice, we're like, well, we're about making disciples. Okay, where does justice fall in discipleship making? We're about making disciples. Okay, where does justice fall in that? What, like, how are we putting our money where our mouth is for people of color? Mm-hmm. And it was burning bridges and hurting me and hurting relationships to the point where I had to divest. I had to step away from that space. I maintain relationships with people in that congregation. Some of them are still really close friends of mine. They still attend the church. We have very honest conversations about why I can and I can't and why they can. But so I think there's a difference between, certainly situational. For me, I was able to walk away from the system and still retain relationships with people. Sometimes you can't do that at all. The hurt is too deep. I would say, again, this is a question of like it being situational and identities impact what the answer to the question is. That punching up versus punching down. If you are on the margins of that community, if your identities place you at the margins, and stepping away is an act of preservation, of safety, do it. Like I make no question about that. Do it. If there's a way back to that, awesome. If you don't want a way back to that, that's okay too. Mm-hmm. And so talking about disposability is not the same as saying you have to stay in relationship. The thing to do, the just thing to do is always stay in relationship. That's how abuse cycles happen. That's how toxic abuse like repeats itself constantly. It's telling people that you have to stay in relationship when they're being hurt. So that's not what this is about. We also have the question of, Alicia, and I think I'll pass this one to you. How do you determine how movable boundaries are? You talked about having to set them, but what about they're movable?
You keep talking about them? I believe so deeply in the power of relationship and what communication can do for us. And so I think that there's need, I don't think anything is static. I don't believe in static reality. I think that there's a lot of fluidity in things. And so constant check-ins, I think are important. Like, where are you today? Like, where are your needs today? Where are you in having triggers, right? Like when people have trauma, and profound trauma that's experienced in communities of folks who've experienced marginalization, you have legitimate triggers, yeah, and that bring about trauma responses. It's so where are you in the navigation of the world for today? Doing that work of asking, I think is what helps us establish like what our boundaries are today. And like and just taking the time, like in meetings, in conversations and relationships of varying sorts, like to like do a check-in. The check-ins make a world of difference. And like the fact that folks can't take 5 to 10 minutes and whatever they're doing to like just like see like with this person, like to acknowledge their humanity and ask like, how are you today? And like, what are your needs in this moment? Is concerning, because I think if like we make that commitment to one another, there's so much that can be done, and done from a place like where we're not seeing people like hurt and ran over and just battered, because we've actually like given a crap about like who they are as like people and not just who they are functionally to us.
I think we're going to go ahead and take it to our last question before we end the recording and go to our after hours Kiki. So this one's coming from Angie. It's kind of a two-parter. So how do you have safe boundaries? Oh, no, that's Irene. I was reading Angie's and Irene added one. Wait, let me read that. Tricked me. All right, we'll start with Angie's. So perhaps cancel culture is the preservation and safety thing, oversimplified. And then the second part of that question is there a way to hold accountable those who are toxic woke as you see its harm on the organization or culture? Alicia, I'm going to punt that to you.
Is there a way to hold folks accountable? I think you have to ask yourself if you're wanting to. Like, how invested are you in these relationships? There are some relationships, like I am just like really clear with myself. It's like, I don't care that much. And it's not that I don't care about people or like generally, like I care about you as a person, but like, I don't care to engage this. Cause like, you know, sometimes I don't have the capacity. Sometimes it's that the depth of relationship isn't such that I feel like it's worth it. And sometimes it's that, like, honestly, my identity configuration, I know is only going to get me so far, because like people are going to see my Blackness, my queerness, my womanhood and question things. And so I will leave that to people who have I believe the responsibility to call in folks in that space where like they have some type of like affinity with people in like the dominant culture that exists there. Because they got work to do too. Like, it's not just on the marginalized, like to push things along. It's like, this is where I think people who are seeking to be allies, and you see, I didn't say allies because I don't believe in allyship just being like, there's a whole, that's
a different series
about it. Something else. But people who are seeking to ally themselves with like others have to do work to show that allyship is a commitment that they want to make. And it's on them, I think, in those situations to have conversations like with people like in these spaces to mitigate the harm. It's not always my responsibility, and I'm not trying to make myself do more work than I need to.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I learned from my time in like super conservative evangelicalism, this is again that like not all bad, not all good thing. And I made a joke about this online last month, I think it was, where I was like, do you all remember accountability partners? Man, that was something else. But so I'm like, I was making fun of it because we did some weird stuff with our understanding of accountability. That being said, the like kernel of like what is good and pure inside of this is like, we can actually learn something from understanding of that, which is one, like the idea of accountability partners implies that like, you are not in that same relationship with everybody in your space, everybody in your community. So the degree of accountability that Alicia and I hold one another to is not the same that, say, Elena and I do. Even though I think Elena's great. I like Elena. But our relationship is not the same degree of intimacy. And so I don't expect the same degree of accountability. And so I think that's something that we can take from something that may have been toxic and unhealthy, personal opinion of mine, and say that there's something good from it. So it looks different from relationship to relationship. Again, it's that DTR, defining that for yourselves. As far as the safe boundaries thing, kind of ending with Irene's question, and how do you have safe boundaries, show integrity for what's right, and also acknowledge that like you can't burn all your bridges. We got to eat. Like you gotta keep your day job, particularly if you are a person of color, if you're queer, if you're disabled, if you're a woman. Like there's these different things where it problematizes your ability to even offer accountability and challenge things. So I would say, even within that, and I'm not sure this is the right answer, but this is the example that's coming to my mind. I'll use the women example. There are men in movement spaces that I know for a fact are dangerous men. I know for a fact have harmed women. And I know several different women, all of us who know this and have had conversations of like, hey, just so you know, that like watch, be careful of that one. And so there's boundary setting and safety that is pursued and understanding between us as women of like, how can we care for one another, knowing that at least in this moment of time, for whatever reason, we can't bring this public. We can't burn that bridge. It's not time yet, but that doesn't mean we can't offer safety and boundaries, that there aren't ways in which to move around this. And I don't know that that's a perfect example, but that's the one that comes to mind for me. We do have to end. I want to honor the time. Final thought before we switch out?
Yeah. I think one thing I will say in response to the last question before we conclude our recorded time together is I know we talked a lot about like defining the relationship in terms of relationships that we have with other people, but I think what's important for everyone to do is like to define like what relationship they're going to be with themselves, like, or the degree of relationship they're going to have with themselves, like in the work. Like there is interrogation of your boundaries, of what you're willing to risk, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do. And that's going to determine like how it is that you engage with others. I think that, yeah, that's a good way to have these conversations around safety. You know what you have the ability to identify what harms you. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work. Mm-hmm. But even with that being said, before you can think about the ways in which you're engaged with other folks, like you need to do the work of interrogating like what it is that you need for yourself, because that's going to determine everything else, whether it be intra movement relationships, like inter-movement relationships, like everything is going to be predicated like off of like what it is that you need. And if you don't do that work for yourself, like you're setting yourself up, I think, for failure in certain ways.
We threw people with the allyship thing. With so many questions popping up in the corner. That might be
after hours Kiki.
We are going to end here for the recording. I want to release those who need to go, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll give you 2 reminders. March 21st is going to be our next session. It again 7:30 to 8:30 with the after hours Kiki afterwards, and that'll be the You Can Stand Under My Umbrella, where we're going to talk about inter-movement relationships. And the other thing was, if you want to, after you get off tonight and you want to post something, or in future conversations, just remember that hashtag HJ Salons, Salon, no S, is how you can tweet or post about this, so that we can find one another and continue conversations beyond this space. So with that, thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to end our recording, and we will see you all on March 21st.